Hello, everyone. It's Clay. I'm introducing this week's podcast. This is a conversation with Mr. Jonathan Thompson, currently living in Greece, but he's from Durango, Colorado, one of my favorite places in the world. He's the author of a number of books, most recently Sagebrush Empire, How a Remote Utah County Became the Battlefront of America's Public Lands. And really, it's a deeper look at the Sagebrush Rebellion, which he says in this interview has been going on really for a very, very long time, although it flared up in the big way after the environmental legislation from Congress during the late 1960s and the 1970s. He's a fascinating man, a kind of quiet, understated man, but what I love about him is that he is not simpleton. He doesn't see any of this very complicated situation from a single perspective. He has respect for the ranch community, for the recreation community, for the mining community, for the heritage people of places like Malta, Montana, and Moab, and Durango, and Telluride. He sees legitimacy in every direction. He also is willing to criticize the environmental movement when it overreacts, etc. And he's net optimistic about the future of our public lands. He's concerned, of course, about Donald Trump's agenda, which is to privatize everything he can possibly privatize, including, giving whole chunks of the public domain in the West back to the states. Fascinating conversation. I've been reading his book and really enjoying it, Sagebrush Empire, which I urge you to take a look at. It's available on Kindle as well as in, of course, print form. Let's go to the program. Follow along at ltamerica.org. Sign up for our weekly newsletter. This is a really, really exciting time in my life, and I'm so glad you're along for the ride. And if you can in any way help us, join the new Friends group, contribute gas cards, whatever it is. We're using the money to fund adventures that I hope will help clarify the state of the union, the state of the American experiment as we approach our 2026 250th birthday. So, Jonathan Thompson, Sagebrush Empire. Let's go to the program. Thanks for listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson. I have the great pleasure today to be talking with Jonathan Thompson, an author, adventurer, editor. Several of his books, Slick Rock Curtain, River of Lost Souls, and most recently Sagebrush Empire, How a Remote Utah County Became the Battlefront of America's Public Lands. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you.
So excited to talk with you. I'm interested in the future of our public lands, and I know you can take a very broad view of all of this. I've been reading your really extraordinary book, and you start with an incident involving the closing of a gate and some very angry cowboys. But you say early on that your interest is not that specific story, although it's an interesting one, but the larger issue of how certain elements of the American West became so enraged about government, about environmentalists, about national monuments, and the conservation agenda overall. So pick it up from there. How did this happen, and what's going on?
Well, I mean, you can go way back and trace the roots of this all, to the original kind of colonial settler movement back in the 1800s that came in. And it's different in different places. My focus for that book was in southeastern Utah, which has been kind of a flashpoint for this kind of stuff. I mean, in a way, since the 1890s. This area was first settled by Mormon settlers, and they were different than in a lot of the other parts of Utah because they had actually been sent there by the church to settle this area, not to make the desert bloom or whatever, but in a way to provide a buffer zone between the gold mining boom that was going on in Colorado, which the church leaders did not approve of, that kind of greed and capitalism and that sort of thing, and all the other stuff that came with it, and to buffer communities that were further west to against the Native American population. So they kind of sent them out into what you could call the wilderness, I guess, and told them, set a place up here, and we're not going to give you a whole lot of support. It was a terrible journey to get there. It was very difficult because the country there is spectacular. but with that spectacularness comes kind of inhospitable, and there's lots of ups and downs, lots of canyons. It's called canyon country. Sometimes people call it standing up country because all the rocks are standing up. And they had to pull wagons and cattle and children across this crazy landscape just to get to this place.
But you're saying, Jonathan, they weren't there to extract gold or other economic value. They were really there to form a kind of a security perimeter around Deseret, around the Mormon homeland in Utah.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and I mean, generally speaking, Mormon settlement was a little different than the other settlement that was going on because it wasn't focused on extraction or natural resources so much as it was on creating this society, basically a theocracy. From there, it was a hard journey. It was a hard thing, and I think that those people and that their descendants sort of acquired a sense of entitlement to the land, and because they were the first white people really who came there, they settled it. They had to fight off Native Americans. They had to fight off cattle barons. They had to fight off cowboys, rustlers, and that sort of thing. And then even early on, they had to fight off, I think in the 1890s, the leaders in Congress basically wanted to turn that area, that county, into a reservation for the Ute Indians because they just wanted to kick the Mormons out. So there's always been kind of this tension here between those people and the outsiders or the federal government. And it just continues on and on over time. And eventually, they did transition into becoming an extractive economy. Like that's naturally, there was all these natural resources. And by the time the uranium boom hit and the oil and gas boom in the 50s, 60s, stuff like that, they became very wealthy because there was so much of that centered there. And then after that, in the 70s, when the environmental movement and the federal government started actually doing land management rather than just turning everything over to the miners and the drillers and the grazers, there was a lot of resentment because they felt like it got in their way. And so since then, it's kind of been almost nonstop battle between the people in this one area and the federal government and environmental movement, that sort of thing. And in a way, it's kind of a microcosm for the whole West because the same things have been happening elsewhere. They tend to go in waves, whereas in this specific area of southeastern Utah, it's kind of constant. But the same thing has happened in Nevada, Idaho, you name it. Usually, though, there are periods of calm in between the flare-ups.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. So, the Mormons had a paranoid style. They felt that they were persecuted. They'd been driven out of Illinois and other places. They found this godforsaken desert and assumed nobody else would really want it. Then suddenly it becomes desirable in a whole range of ways, and that was one element of the Sagebrush Rebellion. Another is that you have this vast public domain out there, and it's different people have different ways of defining it and thinking what its purposes are. And to this day, the people who are out there on public lands, either leasing them or just squatting there, assume that these are resources to be taken and that nobody should really stand between them and their own gumption, their own hard work to pull minerals or to breed cattle and fatten them and so on. So it's really about perception, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think you can look back and you can look at U.S. policy towards those public lands. Really, up until the 70s, there was the policy to dispose of those lands. Like that's what they were there for. You've got the Homestead Act, where you came in and people just said, hey, I want this piece of land. I'm going to put a farm here. Or I'm going to put my ranch here. And after 5 years, they could patent it and they got title to that land. Same with mining claims. Same with the railroads came through. They gave all the land to the railroads. All these, it was a history of disposing of the public domain in order to encourage development there and encourage settlements. It's kind of understandable that they feel that way because that's kind of that's what the history conditioned them to feel. When it started changing, that certainly created, that resentment.
From, say, Jefferson's time until the 1970s, or at least until the New Deal, the sense was have at it. There are resources to be had if you have the willingness to do it. The government's interested in letting you do that, whether you have legal title or not. The 1872 Mining Law, the Homestead Act, and all of its children and cousins. And suddenly the environmental movement picks up in the 1960s and 70s. Monumental legislation is passed, clean water, clean air, the Wilderness Act, etc., and the Environmental Protection Act. And suddenly the people who thought that the West was really theirs for the taking suddenly are being confronted with a regulatory regimen that they just openly resent.
Yeah, I think that's right. In some ways it was sudden. But in other ways it had also kind of been an incremental thing that was going on. Really, it almost started back in the early 1900s when Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, who was his Forest Service guy, they created the Forest Service. And the whole idea there was to take lands out of the public domain and put a little bit more restrictions on them. It wasn't really environmentalism like we think of it. Their idea was to preserve these areas for so that you didn't log all the timber right away, that you would have
sustained yield.
Yeah, sustained yield conservation, in a sense, conserving the resources for later use. But there was also a little bit of it, like overgrazing was already wrecking places and destroying watersheds for towns and creating disease. And so that was part of it. And then in 1934 was the Taylor Grazing Act, which was another big step where you took, before that, grazing on the public domain was a free-for-all, which led to not only overgrazing and environmental problems, but the big fights between the sheep herders and the ranch and the cattle ranchers and all that stuff. So that tried to bring some order to that. But it didn't go over, it didn't go over really easily. It wasn't something that everybody welcomed. And really in the 1940s, you had, and this in a way started also back with Teddy Roosevelt. You got the Antiquities Act in Teddy Roosevelt, and he
1906, the Monuments
1906, and he could start putting, the president could start creating national monuments.
Without congressional votes. This is an executive action uniquely offered to the President of the United States. He can designate at will a national monument. There are some definitions of what should be included, but it's an enormous power that was granted to the President and probably would not pass muster in Congress today.
No, I'm sure it wouldn't. And I think at first, the Antiquities Act probably went over okay. Like it was stuff like the Grand Canyon and kind of starting in the 30s and 40s, you started to get grander designs for these big kind of landscape scale monuments. You had lots of them created, and there started to be some animosity about that amongst ranchers and miners and that sort of thing. And there was some definitely resistance. But of course, none of that really compared to when in the late 60s, early 70s, when you had the EPA created, you had Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. And then in 1976, the Federal Land Policy Management Act, known as FLPMA, that was a big one because it basically turned the public domain into a place that they say multiple use, but that included conservation and stewardship of this vast swath of public lands. And that really changed everything. And then right after that was passed by Congress, Jimmy Carter was elected, and he definitely had more of an environmentalist kind of ethos. And that all sparked the big Sagebrush Rebellion that we call the Sagebrush Rebellion in the late 1970s.
We need to take a short break here. I'm talking with Jonathan Thompson. Fascinating discussion of how the Sagebrush Rebellion really got started. Author of a number of books, more coming, I'm certain. Slick Rock Curtain, River of Lost Souls, and most recently Sagebrush Empire, how a remote Utah county became the battlefront of America's public lands. It's a delight to get to talk with you. When you come back, I want to sense where your own sympathies lie in these debates, because I don't think you have a simple or naive view of what's at stake out in Utah and the American West. We'll be back in just a moment. This is a special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson. Stay tuned. Welcome back, everyone. I'm talking with Jonathan Thompson, who's in Greece, by the way, lives part of the year in Greece, comes back to the U.S., but he is an American at heart, of course, and writes about the American West, award-winning in a number of ways for podcasts and for his writing. Jonathan, this is a really complicated issue. I live in North Dakota. We're not really the West. We're sort of caught between the Midwest and the West, but our badlands include, under the Taylor Grazing Act, the Little Missouri National Grasslands, 1.2 million acres. And the ranchers out there have been there for generations, and they lease those lands. They assume in some sense that they own them because they've been there for several generations, and they resent the fact that these are commons, that these are public lands where people can take their canoes, they can go hiking, they can do all sorts of things that are permitted under federal policy, but the ranchers don't quite see it that way, and they resent that government, especially people from faraway Washington, descend on them from time to tell them, in their view, how they should be managing lands that they already knew how to manage perfectly well. You know the story. You've heard it 100,000 times. I think your sympathies lie in several directions here. I think you have a respect for these landowners and their concerns, even though you might disagree with the aggressiveness of their statements.
I do think it's very complicated. And for me, I mean, I'm somebody who I grew up in southwestern Colorado, grew up visiting public lands. My family goes way back in the region, several generations, and they were farmers and ranchers and miners. And I also, have a lot of respect for the kind of culture that these industries can create in a place. Most of the towns that we think of in the West that are ski areas or resorts or whatever, those were mining towns, and they became what they are because of mining. I mean, Aspen or Telluride or Durango, Moab, they had a lot of wealth at one time in their histories because of mining, and that wealth created these, pretty nice architecture, these main streets that are brick buildings, and kind of a structure that persists today and survives today, even though there's been so much development on top of that, and there's been so much different stuff that's going on. I don't think those towns would be what they are without mining, of course, and without the public lands being a place that was essentially given away to the miners. So I do think that that's important to remember. That's kind of, and also that when you try to get rid of those industries, you are kind of messing with that culture and that history. And that's something that needs to be, I think people need to keep in mind, especially from the environmental standpoint, is like, you have to remember that there really were real people and they were doing real things, and they're not, the miners and the ranchers and that sort of thing are not the ones who are they're not trying to destroy the land. They're just trying to make a living and make a livelihood. So it is complicated. At the same time, I think that a lot of it has turned into something different. I think that outsiders are not only maybe the ones who are coming in and making some of these decisions, like you say, like from Washington, but also outsiders are coming in and kind of using this idea of traditional cultures or heritage to push their ideological agenda, which is, to dismantle the administrative state, as Trump and Musk and Steve Bannon have kind of put it. They're looking for something different. They're not necessarily looking to preserve the culture or preserve this livelihood or whatever, but they're looking more to get the federal land management out of the way and the environmentalists out of the way, so that corporations can come in and do their own thing, which is similarly destructive, not only to the environment, but I think also, again, the culture and the livelihood that has existed there for a long time. And I think sometimes that gets lost as well.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to that in the third segment of the program, what the future of the public lands might look like. I'm thinking of, for example, Moab, which I know pretty well. You have the old mining community, particularly in the 20th century, uranium mining. Then you have the recreationists of two types. You have sort of the purists who want to live as lightly as possible on the land and so on. But you also have sort of what I might call gross recreationists who want to roll around in ATVs and and tear up the land a little bit and really have sort of internal combustion adventures there. And then you have the McMansions of wealthy people who come in for 2 or 3 weeks per year. So you've got a lot of different things roiling around in that community. It's like a palimpsest of different ideas of American economic development and social activity. And they don't really understand each other very well. And so there's a lot of tension out there between these different constituencies. And they don't have really very many forums to get to know each other and to understand each other. So I get why there's tension. Do you have any thoughts about how those tensions can be eased?
I mean, I think part of it in a place like Moab certainly is that, I mean, it's going to be difficult to ease the tensions because it's so hard. There's so many other things going on in Moab. One of them is sort of gentrification, and there's a housing crisis. And so that's going on kind of underneath all this other stuff. And there's these other fights but I think, I mean, there's this motorized recreation crowd, and then there's the quiet users, the backpackers or the hikers. And then there's kind of this thing in between, which is like the adrenaline crowd or the mountain bikers and the base jumpers and that kind of thing. So it seems like those people at least could agree on a common goal, which is that, you don't want the public lands to be transferred into private hands for sure. I mean, I think that's something that they could all agree on probably and get together and fight for, and that would maybe decrease some of the tensions. But I also think that all of those groups probably don't want big uranium mines or potash ponds out in the middle of where they play, or where they enjoy solitude or whatnot. So I think that those groups can certainly get together and work together. And I think, the extractive industries, there could probably be some reduction of tension there too.
One of the arguments made by the people who oppose federal intrusion on the public lands is how much is enough? You've got all these national parks in Utah. You've got a range of national monuments. You have state parks. And I hear again and again, how many more do we need? How much more land do you want to lock up? There are lots of misconceptions there, but from Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante that the opposition is pretty fierce, and there's a view that if you don't resist every time, the United States government will essentially lock up the entire West.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's certainly the perception amongst the opponents of these things. But I mean, I would question the whole idea of it being locked up. If you look at both of those examples you just stated, Grand Staircase Escalante, which is a sprawling 1.9 million, I think, acres. And then Bears Ears, which is 1.6 or 1.3 million acres. They're huge. They drew a line around that area and they called it a national monument, and they put in resource management plans for that monument. But the fact is that things haven't changed that much. If you look at the biggest changes for those things is that they don't allow new mining claims, and they don't allow new oil and gas leases, or for that matter, solar or wind development or that sort of thing. But grazing hasn't changed. Livestock grazing hasn't changed at all. In fact, at Bears Ears, it's almost like there's more grazing allowed under the new national monument than there was before. And access hasn't changed. There's no gates. You don't have to pay to get in. There's very little restrictions on camping. There's not any really additional restrictions on motorized travel than there was before. So those are the types of fights that really are, like I say, kind of more ideological than they are based in any kind of on the ground reality, in my opinion. And I think that's true for both sides, even the supporters, because they think that this national monument status is going to be this huge change. It's going to protect this land forever. And really, when you've got that big of a piece of land and you've only got so much funding, especially now, for enforcement, even if you did up the regulations quite a bit. You don't have the people power to enforce it on that big. I think they only have like one ranger on that place, one law enforcement ranger. And so it's really hard to I mean, the fact of the matter is national monuments, when they're of that scale, don't make a huge amount of difference. So they're really not locking anything up. At the same time, they're not really protecting that much, but it could be a big deal if uranium mining comes back. Then Bears Ears, some parts of Bears Ears would have been big targets for new uranium mining. So that stuff is now protected. And I think that's probably in, a lot of people's interests, including the locals who oppose it, who are now going to have a little bit more tourism for their businesses, because uranium mining is never going to be really a big industry again in that area, but tourism is. And so that's another way where I think you can get relieve some of the tensions, is to kind of convince people or show people it's like, okay, economically, in the long run, this might be better for you.
I hear you. I think I hear you saying, first of all, that a lot of the struggle occurs in sort of a rhetorical space that doesn't have any real grounding in reality, that grazing has been grandfathered in holdings have been grandfathered in, recreation, the roads are open, very little enforcement. So not that much changed, but symbolically in the minds of the local ranch community or people that might have mining interests or people who are Chamber of Commerce types, in their minds there's a symbolic intrusion. It's a takeover. It's something's going to be prevented. Something's going to be limited. They're going to lock something up, and this gets whipped into a frenzy, as you know, every single time. Why does it always get whipped into a frenzy? Why can't people just say what's really going to change, and how can we learn to live with this, and what compromises can be made, and so on? Why does the Sagebrush Rebellion flare up in the way that it does so often?
Uh, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think in the last certainly 20 years or so, it's definitely been just a part of the whole polarization of American politics. It's telling that in 2016 is when Obama designated Bears Ears, and in the lead up to that, there was this huge fight, and then there was another fight after Trump was elected, and then he shrunk the boundaries, and it continued to be kind of this huge fight. And then in 2020, COVID hit, and when that happened, suddenly a lot of the people who were making the loudest noise opposing Bears Ears suddenly shifted directions entirely, including the Bundys. Hammond Bundy became an anti-vaccine and anti-mask mandate kind of, they shifted, a lot of them shifted their fight over to COVID restrictions. It's sort of like this easy transfer. They just forgot about the land use stuff and started focusing on everything else. Meanwhile, the public lands were getting trampled to death because everybody was wanting to go outside, and so they were flocking to the public lands to social distance in an extreme way. So that was really interesting. I mean, I think that kind of shows, well, this is less about even these particular places or public lands than they are about just this bigger polarization and this bigger fight that America's going through.
Every time I go out into that part of the world, Jonathan, some rancher or others, and I love the ranch community and have great respect for it, but they'll say, well, this woman came out from the BLM and she couldn't tell the difference between a heifer and a bull. And there's always that sense of the naive, overeducated outsider who doesn't know anything about the American West coming out and proving her profound ignorance, but yet there to enforce new federal regulations to reduce the number of cow-calf units or whatever it is. And those anecdotes, as you know, just kind of spread like wildfire through the American West, and they're sort of a gotcha about the ineptitude of anybody who doesn't actually live on that land.
Right, right. Yeah, um, and I mean, I think that the other side also is not immune from the same sort of knee-jerk kind of
Of course.
reactions to things. I mean, the that whole thing of they want the federal land managers to live on the land or whatever, that's spurred this movement to move the Bureau of Land Management headquarters to the west, out of Washington. Let's get them to the west. And they tried to do that in Grand Junction. Didn't really work out. But personally, like, I don't think that's such a bad idea. Um,
Don't
and
either.
I I am at odds with a lot of my readers and a lot of my otherwise friends and allies on that that stance, because it's like, look, these people who are opposing all this, that's one of their main things, is that the federal government is an absentee landlord. So let's bring them here. I mean, what's it going to harm? And there's lots of kind of arguments against it, but none of them really ring true. They say, oh, well, it'll give more access to the oil and gas industry or whatever, but I don't see why that's true, because of course the oil and gas industry has lobbyists in Washington, D.C. The mining industry does. Everybody has lobbyists there. It's not going to hurt to have more people on the ground. It's not going to hurt to have the BLM director somewhere where they can drive out to a wild horse roundup and see it in person, or to go see an oil and gas drilling operation, or see some land that's maybe being overgrazed and see what it looks like.
Try living in one of these communities for a couple of
Yeah.
years in Malta, Montana, or Bluff in Utah. If you lived here, you might understand the social dynamics and the heritage of the place. But if you went to Brown University and work for BLM in Washington, D.C., and you're a sort of young idealist, that's all an important perspective, but it may not give you the understanding that you would have if you lived in Bozeman or if you lived in Spokane or Boise.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that one of the problems with sort of the environmental movement when they oppose this is that they make this assumption that a town like Grand Junction or Moab, or these western places are kind of, they're backwater places, and they're kind of run by the oil and gas industry, or they're run by the extractive industries. And so if they move their headquarters there, they would be unduly influenced by those people. But that's not really true. I mean, yes, it may have been at one time, but if you look at most of these towns, any town, I would say, that has pretty good access to public lands has transitioned to a different kind of economy and a different kind of culture. And there's a real mix of people there that do care, and they value, especially recreation on public lands. And so I think, that's one place where certainly I think there is a knee-jerk reaction from the environmentalist side, but that they could drop that because there's bigger things to worry about right now, especially.
Absolutely. I lived in Boulder, Colorado for a couple of years, and I remember the rallying cry, cattle free in 93, and so on. The environmental movement often overstates it, often overreacts, often engages in knee-jerk environmentalism, and often treats the people, the heritage people out there, as rubes and yokels and rednecks. And so there's no one's here saying that there's not fault on both sides. Jonathan, we need to take a short break. This is a fascinating conversation with Jonathan Thompson, the author of Sagebrush Empire, How a Remote Utah County Became the Battlefront of America's Public Lands. This is a special edition of Listening to America. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson, talking with Jonathan Thompson about the West. America has the West, and John Wesley Powell, the great explorer and Civil War veteran, marked the 100th meridian, which runs through Bismarck, North Dakota, and Pierce, South Dakota, and North Platte, Nebraska, as the dividing line between East and West. Famous map showing that there's not enough water west of that line, generally speaking, to support dryland agriculture. And if you're going to make the West bloom, or if you're going to inhabit the West, you're probably going to need to have irrigation systems and dams and canals and so on. So the West has a kind of a unique status in the United States. It's also the land of mythology, of Marlboro Man and cowboys and rugged individualists and so on. Jonathan Thompson, we've gotten this far into this conversation, and someone listening would probably rebuke us both, saying, how can you have spent so much time talking about this without ever mentioning Native Americans? What's the Native American element in this as we move forward?
Obviously, the Native American indigenous element is huge. It was here before this was called the West, and the public lands that we talk about, the public domain, it was all stolen from indigenous people, usually by either force or the threat of force. Only recently has any of that been kind of started to be tried to repair or heal some of that. We did have our last Interior Secretary was from Laguna
Deb
Pueblo,
Holland of New Mexico.
New Mexico, yeah, Deb Holland, and I should say, going back to talking about Bears Ears, that on the one hand, I'm saying that it doesn't make a big difference, but there is the symbolic thing, and one of the symbolic things about that is that there is some co-stewardship, co-management with indigenous nations, tribal nations, and representatives from there. So, and they did try under their resource management plan to incorporate indigenous knowledge into that plan. How that will work in the long run, it's hard to say. Whether that plan will even stay or whether the monument will stay, we don't know yet. But it's a big step, I think, towards something new and a different way of looking at public lands and managing public lands and interpreting them. I think that's a big part of what's going on there. And that's one thing about a national monument, is that it's not just this big piece of public land, but it's got boundaries around it, and it's got a little bit of funding so you can start putting up educational things and signs and telling people what they're seeing. And I think I'm certainly looking forward to seeing how that might play out in Bears Ears and what that might look like, to look at the Bears Ears or Comb Ridge or one of these land formations and understand what the significance is for the Hopi people and the Zuni people and the Navajo people and the Ute people. That's, I think, exciting. Where that will go in the next 4 years, I don't know, but further out into the future, there's this huge movement to have better tribal consultation, to include indigenous people more in public land management. And there's certainly a big push to get the tribes their rightful water rights to the Colorado River. They were left out of the Colorado River Compact in 1922.
1922, right.
They made a lot of mistakes in 1922 with the Colorado River Compact, some of them which they, for example, overestimated how much water there was in the river.
A fatal error.
Which is coming back to bite us all in the butt right now. But also there's this kind of looming question of where are the tribes going to get their water rights, which they have by right, they have a huge...
Under the Winters Doctrine, they have substantial water rights for any water flowing through their lands.
Right. Yeah. Like they have, maybe you could argue that they have rights to the entire Colorado River.
Prior rights, yes. So I want you to rise up to 38,000 or 50,000 feet. You have the advantage. You're currently living in Greece. So you get a little distance on what's going on. I don't want this to be about the Trump moment, because I do believe that will pass. If he gets away with his plans, it's going to be the privatization of much of the American West. I don't think that will happen. But go up in a hot air balloon to about 50,000 feet and assess the public lands in America at this juncture. We're about to observe our 250th birthday. How well are we doing, and where are your concerns about the future of the West?
That's a good question. That's a hard one. I think we're doing reasonably well. I think that we've progressed certainly over the years, and we continue to make progress. Maybe we're having a setback now, but I do agree that we're on the correct trajectory. The biggest threats to public land, obviously climate change is a big one that's a threat, and that's not something that you deal with kind of really on a regional basis in a way.
It's a global issue.
Certainly the other threat is oil and gas development, and energy development in general, I think, is a huge threat because sure, Biden tried to kind of rein in oil and gas, but at the same time, he was permitting solar and wind like it was, you know, like crazy. And both, one is certainly better for the climate, obviously, and better for a lot of things, but they both are damage public lands, and they both take land out of, essentially take it, in a way, take it out of public hands. Once you put up, especially a solar array, that becomes a private piece of land. And so you're taking that out, besides killing all the vegetation and ruining habitat and that sort of thing. So I do think that one way or another, energy development is going to be, continues to be a huge threat. But I also think that recreation is a threat. And I don't just mean motorized recreation, I mean all kinds of recreation. I just mean people kind of flooding the public lands. And so, loving it to death is the cliche term, but that's another thing that we need to deal with. And that it's not, I think nobody really knows what to do about that. That's a tough one. What are you supposed to do? Tell people they can't go there and shut people out? But I do think, every year, every administration that goes by, there's kind of a few steps forward with regulations, with tribal consultation in land management decisions, and just kind of progressing, and just the public becoming more aware. I mean, the fact that so many people are talking about these things right now is good and valuable. That so many people are worried about the privatization of public lands, that's good and valuable. And I think that's what's going to keep it from happening. So I think we become to value them more and more as the rest of the world gets built up and populated and kind of wrecked. So I'm optimistic as far as the long-term thing goes, but I think that people are going to need to keep fighting for it and keep fighting to preserve these places and keep fighting to, yeah.
Let me give you my perspective about this just as a way to set up your commentary. I've lived west of the 100th meridian most of my life. I'm never happier than I'm wandering in a car somewhere in the American West with no particular destination, and you come around a corner and you see some magnificent thing that you've never seen before, or some gravel road that goes off into the hills and you just want to turn on it and see where that takes you. You know that feeling, of course. And I had thought that there was kind of a settlement, that after the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s, we had kind of created a settled basis of how we were going to look at and manage public lands, and we had sort of topped up all of the laws to protect what we could protect. And I thought that was sort of a permanent settlement of the American West. But it's not true, is it? It's a daily, hourly struggle, and there are forces that want to undo that settlement, and they're not lazy. They work extremely hard at it. And so the idea that with rare minerals coming in, maybe a new nuclear age coming in, giant wind farms, the enormous energy costs of AI, those things represent a pressure, a deep pressure on what we took to be this sort of enlightened settlement.
Yeah, I think that's true. I guess for me, like, I agree with you. I think I also feel, when I'm out there driving on the public lands, and I say this, I don't mean the national parks or something like that. I mean, out in the middle of nowhere, out across some sage plain, that to me represents, that's America or whatever. That's freedom. I feel free when I'm doing that. And I think that's part of what public lands are. And that's where I kind of do agree with the Sagebrush Rebels is, yeah, like that's part of their greatness, is that you have a sense of freedom out there to do what you want within certain reason. And I feel like that is being encroached upon by various things, whether it's, the pressure of all this recreation, for example, that means you have to shut down some places, or I understand the reason for that and I get it and I support it, but at the same time, it does take away from my freedom as well to go out and set up a tent by the road and camp out. But I think the same is true with resource extraction. Like I say, when you put up a solar panel, a solar farm, or a wind turbine throw up an oil and gas field in the middle of one of these sage plains, again, you're taking away freedom from that because you're kind of handing it over to the corporations in so many ways, and it's just harder to get around. And personally, I don't mind if I'm out there in the middle of nowhere and there's no one around and it's a beautiful view and there happens to be a pump jack pumping oil. I don't care. That's fine. It doesn't bother me really. And I know I'm not with everybody, but on that, that doesn't take away that sense of the beauty. It doesn't take away the beauty for me, or
Right,
the
but a strip mine might, and a giant
strip mine might.
solar array might, and a giant wind farm might, and a nuclear
Yes,
power plant might.
exactly. And if that oil well, or if a uranium mine or something like that is contaminating the water, then that's going to take away things as well. Or if birds die when they crash into a wind turbine, that's going to take something away as well. So those things are all threats to that sense of public lands, and the freedom and that thing that we get from public lands that I think everybody kind of gets if they've spent any time in them.
Yeah, and I think Edward Abbey would say, look, park your car. You can, if you walk off the asphalt trail in any national park in America, you can essentially have it to yourself. That it's really about automobiles, and it's about amenities like ice cream and pizza. It's about the selfie stick and the where the Park Service says, beautiful vista or observation point. If you get off of all of that and just get into the heart of Yellowstone or into the heart of Zion, you're not alone necessarily, but you're almost certainly almost alone.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the advantages of doing something like Bears Ears National Monument is that the managers can say, and they have done this, they've divided into zones. So there's the front country zone, that's the zone where they put in the parking lots and the signs and the little trails and the toilets and all that stuff, all the infrastructure, so that they kind of contain people in that area. And then there's these three other zones that go back to, I think, backcountry or wilderness or something like that is the farthest one out. And that's no development, no nothing. And they block people from going there, but they certainly don't encourage it. So you have, I think in that way, you certainly can corral the crowds around, and the other people who don't want to follow the crowds, they can still have a real nice experience.
Two last questions. I'm sorry we've run out of time. I'm talking with Jonathan Thompson, a fascinating discussion of the public lands in America. I urge all of you to buy his book, Sagebrush Empire. I've been reading it. It's extraordinary. What's your next book?
That's a good question. I'm not working on one right now. I've been kind of busy with all kinds of other stuff, so I don't have one in the works right now, but hopefully I will before too long.
As you look at the Trump phenomenon, I've tried to avoid talking about it because for lots of reasons here, but as you look at what he would like to do to the public lands of America, how likely is he to succeed in turning federal lands back to the states, allowing mining and other economic activities in national parks, greatly reducing the size and number of our national monuments, etc.? What's your worst case prediction, and what's your more pragmatic observation?
Well, we know last time he shrunk Bears Ears, he shrunk Grand Staircase Escalante, he shrunk some other ones. Those ones that then they were challenged by lawsuits, but before the lawsuits could be settled, that Biden came in and reversed the reversal. So that was all put on hold, and now that'll be all. So, I mean, I guess the worst case scenario is that he'll come and do it again, and that the courts will side with Trump.
This time, yeah.
Is this time? Last time they didn't side or not side with him. We don't know. The courts they shot down Utah's bid to try to take over public land. So the courts so far have ruled in a way that I think is in public land's favor. And I would have thought maybe a couple months ago that the Supreme Court would not go our way or public land's way, but now I feel like they be more environmentally inclined than we think they are, even though they're conservative. And I think they're more willing to stand up to Trump than we might think they were as well. So that's good. I mean, but the worst case scenario is that the courts would side with Trump. I think another worst case scenario probably is that the Antiquities Act, that Congress could get rid of the Antiquities Act altogether. And I think that would be unfortunate because if Congress doesn't change, there's no way that they're going to be creating new national monuments or new national parks or doing anything. I mean, it's just a dysfunctional body
We
right
need
now.
executive authority for those sorts of things.
Yeah, and I mean, I hate to say it, but I think we do. So I think that would be another worst case scenario. More pragmatically, I think that there's going to be enough resistance to that to overt attempts to transfer public land that I don't think that's going to happen. A big wholesale, like here, Utah, you can have it, or here, Exxon, you can have this. We're not going to see that, I don't think. There's just too much opposition from too many corners, including, I mean, Ryan Zinke, who was Trump's Interior
Amazing,
Secretary.
isn't it?
Yeah, he introduced legislation that would block any kind of transfers of public land. So I don't think that's going to happen like that. What could happen is that if, Musk and his Doji stuff, if they got the federal agencies enough so that it just becomes completely dysfunctional, then somewhere down the line, people might start saying, look, these guys don't know how to manage this place, and we better privatize it. And it could be a sort of an incremental thing. And some of that's already happened. I mean, national parks, when you go camp at a national park, you're not camping, you're not giving your money to the government, you're giving your money to a concessionaire. When you buy pizza, it's a concessionaire. There's a lot of privatization already going on in that sense. I mean, I think that would be the scary thing too, is that it just kind of happens over very slowly and incrementally without people really kind of realizing what's happening. I do think that, I mean, even now, even with the layoffs and the firings that are going on now, some of them have been reversed because the courts have come in and said, nope, sorry, you can't do that. With the Forest Service, for example, a bunch of those employees were rehired. And there's been big protests at Zion and Arches and lots of the national parks. So there's definitely an upswelling of resistance to these ideas. And so I think in the long run, I think it'll be okay.
Let's leave it there. It's a really nice and optimistic place to leave it. I've so enjoyed this conversation, Jonathan Thompson. I hope we meet again, and next time I'm in Greece, I shall try to find you. So thank you for your time today, and I urge everyone to take a look at your book, Sagebrush Empire, How a Remote Utah County Became the Battlefront of America's Public Lands. We'll see you all next week.